Hello, everyone. My name is Max, and today we're talking to Anna Ohanyan, who is a distinguished professor of political science and international relations at Stonehill College. And she's also a senior non-resident scholar in the Russia and Eurasia program at Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And also, she recently published a book on the neighborhood effect, the imperial roots of regional fracture in Eurasia with the Stanford University of Press. So hello, Anna.
Hi, Maxim.
So, Anna, I have several questions that I would like to ask you, and I will start with the first one. What's your view on the latest developments in Ukraine?
Well, I think obviously the situation surrounding the nuclear power plant is very, very worrisome. We'll see how much success does the IAEA, International Atomic Energy Agency, produces and develops on this, as a diplomatic track. But overall, in terms of the developments, I think it's becoming increasingly clear that the war is settling into a war of attrition, and the academic scholarship seems to be divided as to whether this will push the sides to come to a compromise or not. And there's growing, on the one hand, you could argue that as a war of attrition, this creates these types of wars, especially that there is a proxy war dynamics also present. Because there is no clear winners and losers, these types of wars tend to drag on. And I'm just really worried that those are the patterns that we're seeing right now. At the same time, considering that United States and the Western powers have supported Ukraine militarily without putting their troops on the ground, so in that respect, this kind of shapes as a proxy war. And needless to say that Russia already was supporting its proxies in the Donetsk before this latest invasion. So as a proxy wars tend to last longer than usual, but at the same time, this proxy war structure allows external powers to disengage quickly as well. But looking at the public opinion surveys inside Ukraine that are carried out, Professor Gerald Cole has been carrying this out from University of Virginia. It looks like the Ukrainian public is not ready for a compromise, is willing to, even though the support for the war versus a compromise negotiated settlement tends to vary depending on whether people live closer to the war theater or not. But overall, it doesn't look like there is political momentum or a push for finding a compromise. So the latest developments, I think I'm not finding much analysis that highlights a so-called ripeness for the conflict to find a resolution. So yeah, this is my read.
Okay, I see. And what do you think is Russia trying to achieve in Ukraine? What ultimate goal do they have in mind?
Let me give you two answers. On the one hand, more of a tactical level. I think the Kremlin's stated objectives have shifted definitely. Right before the invasion, in preparation to it in the early days, the Kremlin's goals were very vast: denazification and regime change, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And overall, it's very hard to now tell. This is not a transparent power. This is not a democratic state. So therefore, its goals are not publicly stated, or even when stated, it's very clear to hold them to it. There's credible commitment problem, so to speak, meaning whether you can trust the word of the Kremlin. But basically, I do think that judging by the military strategy, Russia's military strategy, as how they pull back from Kiev, from the north, and concentrated on the Donbas region, I'm reading this as a recalculation and focusing on the eastern part as a territorial capture. At the same time, if judging from the rhetoric as well as the early action and some of the military activities that have carried out in the south, as well as Russia's policies pushed her surrounding the food and the food security, global food security, by controlling and limiting, preventing Ukraine from exporting wheat and grain. So I'm wonder whether Kremlin is also working towards trying to cut off Ukraine from the Black Sea, making it a landlocked state. But right now doesn't look like militarily it is able to pull it off. That's my read. But in the long term, at the same time, if you study Russia historically, Russia has always relied on external, what Stephen Kotkin, a historian at Princeton University, calls perpetual geopolitics, relying on this external incursion, external crisis to compensate for domestic reform. And we see this Russian invasion in Ukraine sort of supporting this dynamic of creating an external crisis, securitizing its foreign relations, which I don't want to argue that this was all done by the Kremlin as a diversionary tactic from domestic problems. I think the Kremlin has significant hold over its domestic politics, but still, I think the Russian state has several dimensions that carry over from Soviet years all the way to the Russian Empire, which is to try to punch above its belt, above its weight category, pretty much to use a sports analogy, but also constantly create this mentality that Russia is under siege, that the rest of the world wants to dismember Russia. So therefore, this war is built in Russia as an existential threat for Russia, meaning that Russia does not have a choice, that this is a war of necessity. That is the rhetoric that is being sold domestically inside Russia, and it's not a new narrative. This has been going on for a while, which perhaps partly explains as to why a majority of Russians seem to be supporting Putin still.
So do you think that he's actually trying to rebuild the Soviet Union, calling Ukraine as a non-existent state? So do you think that in his plans to continue further expansion if Ukraine fails?
I don't think so. I don't think that Soviet Union as a model can be recreated, or that even Putin is willing or is working to that end. I think definitely Russia wants to continue to maintain influence over the post-Soviet neighborhoods, and I'm not sure whether post-Soviet frame is now useful even to be used in explaining this. But still, I think definitely Russia and all leadership, even predating Putin, before Putin, have tried to maintain influence over the post-Soviet space. But I don't think trying to recreate Soviet Union is realistic, or is that, I don't think Putin is working to that end. And moreover, I would argue that by trying to, Russia was positioned and was working towards it in creating regional institutions, whether it's Eurasian Economic Union, CSTO, sort of mimicking the West and creating regional organizations in which Russia has a dominant position. But with this war in Ukraine, it's pretty obvious that Russia does not want to, or is not capable, either in terms of its capacities or politically, in using these organizations that it created to maintain influence over Eurasia. Peaceful, by the way. So essentially being in Eurasia as a peaceful competitor relative to other greater powers. So no, I don't think Soviet Union can be recreated. There are, all the republics are now independent states with varied levels of political capacity. Russia lacks the political as well as the military or economic tools, as well as ideational power, the soft power that Soviet Union had in recreating anything similar. So no, I don't think that's the case, but that does not mean that Russia might not attempt similar interventions in other parts of the post-Soviet context.
I see. And what do you think are the highest risks for Ukraine right now, and how can our leadership address them?
I think I'm looking at this from a perspective of diplomacy and conflict resolution. Of course, there is a debate in political science as to whether wars ending through victory consolidation or negotiated settlement are more effective to sustain, which one is a better outcome in terms of durability of peace. Overall, war as a tool of ending conflicts violence has declined in its political utility since the 1970s. And we're seeing this. We see that Russia is not able to achieve its goals militarily. That Russia lost so much political power inside Ukraine, in Europe. It's now politically isolated, economically contained. So I think while on the one hand, this is not surprising that Russia is not able to achieve its goals militarily. At the same time, I think the costs for Ukraine are enormous as well. According to the World Bank report, it is projected that by next year, over half of the population in Ukraine might live below poverty line, close to the poverty line. So I think the risks for, if the war continues, there are risks for Putin, that's for sure, because it creates the need for mass mobilization, which he does not want to do. The longer the war goes on, the economic costs on Russia might become more apparent. But still, Russia is rich in resources. I think Russia will be a much weaker power economically, but at the same time, it will make Russia a lot more dangerous, an unpredictable power as well. But for Ukraine, as a nascent democracy, as a young state where democratic institutions are still forming, having if the war continues, it will place a continued economic stress on the country. Of course, the refugees and migration levels. But more importantly, even if there is a ceasefire or a settlement, I expect Russia to continue to use this conflict to constantly pressure Ukraine. So not finding a negotiated settlement or a compromise or ceasefire actually right now in order to start any meaningful negotiated process, short of a ceasefire, Ukraine is going to have to learn to live with this open wound on its eastern front line. So on the one hand, there are costs to continued warfare, but at the same time, there are costs to peace, and it's unclear. I mentioned earlier, it looks like the public is not ready for compromise, and whether the government in Kiev will be, right now is not talking compromises, it's talking will be recovering all of the territory, including Crimea. Militarily, I'm not sure if it's possible, but at the same time, I just do not see the risks of I would argue that the cost of warfare are much higher for Ukraine than the cost of peace. But this could be my inclination for conflict resolution, diplomatic, peaceful negotiation, talking in me. But again, looking at it in terms of large data, similar conflicts, I would argue that it is in the shorter war would be in Ukraine's interest. Having said that, I think this war is so unique that is we have to be careful in not generalizing from other conflicts. This is an interstate war, and interstate wars have nearly disappeared. So it's since the 1970s. So as such, this is such anachronistic, such a different event. This is a war of conquest. This is a war of forcefully changing territorial boundaries. It is a war involving a nuclear state. So it is a war with a country that controls significant geographic space inside the Eurasian continent. So in many respects, this is very unique, unprecedented. We're in uncharted territories. But looking at it from the perspective of countries who are conflict patterns, exit strategies, I think there are risks for Ukraine, for Ukrainian state, its institutional sovereignty if the war continues.
Excuse me, do you think there is a chance for new peace talks between Ukraine and Russia, or you think there's chances very low?
I think there's always an opportunity. There's always time to talk. It's always necessary to talk, I would argue. A diplomatic channel should always be open, and I don't know whether such conversations are happening or not behind closed doors. But looking at the strategic positioning, Putin's looks like Putin is counting, I think till this winter, he's counting that the continuous war and the energy prices inside Europe are going to create political backlash political upheaval in Europe, in the West, and American midterm elections are coming up, and then this will limit the European support, the Western support on Ukraine, and in that case, it can have better terms at the negotiating table. And on the Ukrainian side, I mentioned again, the position is still pretty maximalist. There's whether in the government or among the public, if we're to rely on the surveys that we're seeing. So while a diplomatic breakthrough or negotiated settlement is not very likely, but I think the emphasis should be placed on a ceasefire agreement and stopping the violence in order to create political space to have conversations on a negotiated settlement.
I see. And what do you think the West can do additionally to help Ukraine? And what can Ukraine do more to attract more support from the West and especially United States?
I think the diplomacy coming out from Kiev and President Zelensky has been really impressive. He has been working around the clock in generating public support around the world. And the fact that this is a war of annexation, a war of conquest, actually reverberate around the world. Every nation, every country, especially small countries in the world are stakeholders in this war. If Russia digests this, if Russia normalizes this, this weakens the norm of peaceful coexistence or the support of territorial integrity of states. So the Western public support for the Ukrainian government, as well as political military support, has been really impressive. But at the same time, despite the historic level of military commitments, it just simply ended up fueling this war of attrition. It just has not been enough to give Ukraine an upper hand in this military confrontation. And that, I would argue that it's probably would be very, very hard to achieve, considering that Russia has poured so much with its challenges, and to put it mildly, in military posturing. It's still a military state. It has always been a military state. So I'm not sure whether Western support could close the asymmetry, the military symmetry that exists between Russia and Ukraine. I actually would argue that the West needs to maybe support Ukraine in terms of figuring out, building a negotiation process, and maybe using the sanction regimes and incentivizing Putin and trying to shape Putin's behavior on the battlefield. Sanction regimes in general is criticized around the world for not being sensitive enough to it's easier to apply sanctions, but it's much harder to take the sanctions off. So as a result, they're not flexible enough of an instrument to control behavior of the target state, in this case, Russia. So I think what the West could do, United States in particular, is to signal that if there is change of behavior on the side of Russia, that there will be a close and immediate sanction relief in some packages. But of course, we have to keep in mind Russia is rich in resources. Prior to this war, Russia was under 57 groups of sanctions already. So it has learned to live with sanctions, but at the same time, I don't think Russia was prepared to live under economic containment, which is essentially way more than a sanctions regime which the West has applied. So this is really unprecedented as well. But still, I think the West has been crystal clear that this is Ukrainian government, Ukrainian people's decision whether to compromise or not, that they will not push Ukraine one way or the other. So it is going to be Ukraine's decision as to what to request from the West. My personal, very small voice as a scholar of peace and conflict studies would be for the West and Ukraine to work together to figure out a way how to achieve a ceasefire. Russia is a much weakened power, but it's too nuclear enough, too big enough to still continue to do a lot of damage, whether in Ukraine or elsewhere in Eurasia.
But you mentioned this strategy that Putin has waiting for the winter, and it feels like he will again use this energy blackmailing and forcing European countries to give up support for Ukraine, and maybe he will reach this objective. What do you think?
I'm not sure. I think the support for Ukraine is quite substantial. It's quite possible. I should not be speaking for Europeans. I don't live in Europe, so I have not studied the European domestic politics closely enough to see where the electorate will shift. But in the context of the United States, I think there's substantial support for Ukraine just on a personal level. I mean, I drive to, but I do live in Northeast, which is much more liberal part of the country, Democratic, a lot more support for the Democratic Party, Biden's party, and the Ukrainian flags are everywhere. And the opinion surveys here in the United States among the American voters demonstrate that there's still continued support for Ukraine. So partly because the American citizen is American public is a bit more shielded from the energy tool, Russia's energy instruments. If the Europeans waver, I think the the American public is still much more, is quite strongly mobilized. But I think what the European leaders should be making, they need to be continuously making the argument for support of Ukraine. I think if the war continues, that will be costly for Russia as well. While this is a country that is accustomed with, is comfortable in, not comfortable, at least accustomed in living or utilizing the war as a crisis, securitized foreign policy for domestic purposes. But I think continuously doing so, well, while countries should be, oil-rich countries should be thinking about energy transition, I think that's also costly. And again, I think Russia also needs to keep in mind that right now it's basically selling off its resources to India and Russia and China for much below market prices. But and considering that the energy markets are going to shift sooner or later, they're already shifting, it's just foolish, I would argue, for Kremlin not to capitalize on selling its energy resources to Europe, which was its largest market, 2 times bigger than the one in China. It was a much more expensive market. So I think Russia does have incentives to not to shoot at its markets pretty much, but also continue to rebuild some of that markets as soon as it can.
I see, Anna. And Anna, and one last question, could you briefly touch upon your book that I mentioned at the beginning about its key message?
Sure. I think the key message of the book is to essentially what I tried to answer, the question I answer in this book is, why is it that with the end of the Cold War, some of the regions emerged peacefully and other regions found themselves in conflict? And what I argue in the book is that the imperial roots, pre-Soviet roots of connectivity between communities need to be studied in order to understand contemporary dynamics of armed conflict, which are normally defined and analyzed as post-Soviet wars. So I argue for the regional dimension in driving conflict as well as peace. And one way to study this, I argue, is peripheries of empires, which tell a lot. For example, the Bosnian province in the Habsburg Empire, the Anatolia province in the Ottoman Empire, and then the Transcaucasia in the Russian Empire. So what I argue is that the way these peripheries were connected, some more socially connected than others, determines the chances of the statehood after the end of the Cold War, when the Soviet system collapsed and the freeze from these relationships has melted, so to speak. So essentially, it is a book about societal connectivity at the regional level, which the rise of the states essentially eroded sometimes. So this is a book about civic legacies, originally wired social connectivities. And another sub-theme of the book is that countries, smaller states, are able to survive if they're able to manage geopolitical rivalry, great power clashes, which tend to be formerly imperial powers. So it's an attempt to look at these conflict regions as well as the regions that emerge peacefully from this level of social connectivity between people in the context of great power rivalry, how well regions are able to manage the great power rivalry, which can do a lot of damage in these regions.
And you mentioned in the book about Ukraine, right?
I did. I do have a section on Ukraine. While it is not one of the specific, it is actually listed as one of the conflicts studied, but there's a pretty hefty chapter on Ukraine. So what I think, actually, what the theory of this neighborhood connectivity would argue that it is not based on the connectivity of Ukrainians and Russians as part of the Russian Empire, right? That we should not be seeing at this level of armed violence, armed conflict. But of course, this is a case as to when a great power, in this case, an imperial power, engages in a conflict. So on the one hand, you could say that regional connectivity is necessary, but not a sufficient condition in managing geopolitical rivalry. That's one of the messages, but also that looking back, whether the Donbas conflict, whether with all the problematic nature of the Minsk agreement, whether that path should have been pursued. And there was not much, that agreement was not popular inside Ukraine. But of course, hindsight is 2020, and it's easier to analyze looking back. But I do wonder whether investing more in that peace process would have been sufficient in preventing the war, or that Russia was already was looking for a clash regardless. But it's just, I would argue that the war demonstrates not to underestimate the capacity of great powers, imperial powers, of self-sabotage, because the war is definitely will damage Ukrainian state, Ukrainian society in many respects, but it's also pushed back Russia, rewinded Russia in many respects. Now, Russian economy will be a lot more primitive than its competitors. It's much weaker power relative to China and will assume a secondary position relative to China. Its economy will struggle to modernize. It lost significant political influence internationally and globally, in Europe, to name a few. And Russia was actually set to working with China and plow through, be an important engine in Eurasian integration, which is also a message in the book as to how countries would benefit from the fully integrated Eurasian continent, not the type that scholars such as Dugin has been arguing for. Definitely, that's not what I'm arguing, but Russia was positioned to be an engine for progressive development in this continent. And essentially, Russia perpetuated this historic pattern of regional fracture. But of course, it takes more, especially in Ukraine. Regional connectivity between Ukraine and its neighbors is just not sufficient if great power rivalry is unchecked. And of course, the fact that Ukraine-Belarus connections at the governmental level were problematic, and we know as to why. So that also Belarus basically was used. Essentially, Ukraine-Belarus region had remained a region, a fractured region, which made it possible for Russia to utilize that cleavage to its advantage.
All right, Anna, thank you so much. And thanks so much for taking your time today to answer all my questions.
Sure, it's a pleasure. Thanks for the invitation, Maxim.